So, welcome everyone to the Association for Social Economics webinar podcast series. Throughout the series, we will explore the profound and multifaceted impact of economics. This podcast series is sponsored by the ASE, whose mission is to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and the broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. Each month, I get a chance to sit down and interview scholars in the field. I am your host, Iris Booter, and with me today, I have Dr. John Davis, Professor of Economics, Emeritus at Marquette University, and Professor of Economics and Business, Emeritus at the University of Amsterdam. Dr. Davis studied philosophy at the University of Illinois with an emphasis on ethics, history of philosophy and Marx, and economics at Michigan State University, focusing on the history of economics, methodology, labor, and macroeconomics. Dr. Davis is the author of Keynes's Philosophical Development, The Theory of the Individual in Economics, Individuals and Identity in Economics, and Identity, Capabilities, and Changing Economics. He is also the co-author with Marcel Baumans of Economic Methodology, Understanding Economics as a Science, and co-author with Robert McMaster of Healthcare Economics. Dr. Davis has also served as the editor of the Review of Social Economy from 1987 to 2005. He was co-editor with Wade Hands of the Journal of Economic Methodology from 2005 to 2019, and editor of the Routledge Advances in Social Economics book series 1996 through present. So thank you, John, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little more about yourself, your background, and what inspired you to get into the field of economics?
Well, I think my long time in the Association for Social Economics gives me some perspectives. I grew up in the Chicago area, middle-income family, middle-class family. In the 1970s, I was redirected in my expectations of what I should be doing in life. Because I went to good schools, I thought, oh, I should become a lawyer. And then Vietnam happened, and like many people of my age group, it transformed our whole view of what was important. It was an anti-imperialist movement. It was a tremendous break with older people, and I think many people's lives were redirected. And so, though I had begun studying philosophy at University of Illinois because I thought that was a good thing for going to law school. Then I thought, well, I'm not going to law school. And so I decided to move into economics. And there were some crossovers. I was doing some history of philosophy. And so it was natural to look at history of economics. And then I was introduced to political economy, all the founders of the field of economics. And that gave me a set of different views about what economics was about than your ordinary microeconomics course. So I was rather shocked when I first started taking microeconomics. I found it strange and unrealistic. But by the time I was in graduate school at Michigan State, with the history of economic thought people who were there, I started to see new ways to talk about economics. So my history sort of is accidental, like many people. Things come along, but I stress that the Vietnam experience really changed lives for a lot of people. And it stays with you, those views that you develop and the values that you develop.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And you mentioned you've been a longtime active member of the ASE. So could you really discuss what motivated you to get involved in the organization and even stay involved with the ASE?
Again, some accidents here. So the editorship for the Review of Social Economy came open in 1987. It had been at DePaul University, but it moved to, the journal moved to Marquette, and they needed to have a person who would not only edit, but in the tradition of Marquette and DePaul and other schools, teach economics and ethics. So I applied for the position, and I think because I had a philosophy background and had studied ethics, I was a natural candidate. And so I did teach economics and ethics there for many years. But what really was a big part of my life was the editing of the review. So the review was in a changeover itself in time between generations of scholars. I don't know if people have the history of the journal down. I've got some of it in the paper that I've suggested that you share. It's a history of social economics, and I talk, among other things, about the change in the Association for Social Economics. So the review had been really transformed in 1970. It had originated back in post-war 1944 in the Catholic Economic Association, one of the founders of the ASSA. But the origins and history of social economics were very cooperativist. And so the early people in the Catholic Economic Association welcomed and brought in all sorts of heterodox thinkers, institutionalists, post-Keynesians, later feminists, a number of different approaches, Marxists, and the association renamed itself the Association for Social Economics. And as I came in now in '87 to be the editor, the people who were so instrumental in that changeover were mostly leaving the profession, leaving professional work, leaving their university positions. And I was very young, and so I was sort of at loose ends about how to proceed. But I did have good support, and I gradually learned how to bring new voices into the association through publishing. And so many of the people who were active in the ASE and published in the journal for years after were people I published some of their first papers. And it was a learning experience for me. And it was also, again, this inadvertence in life, a way in which the association rebuilt itself over time with new people. And that's something I'll stress a little bit later, the constant refounding of the ASE as people change over, because it's sometimes hard to see how when an original generation leaves the scene, where new people find a place. Well, so I began with a journal, and it was self-published in the sense that I had to find all the copy editing. I had to send the copy out to the printer. I had to arrange to have it sent to the post office to be shipped out, and it was a very difficult job. What I then began to explore was taking the journal to Routledge. And at first there was some resistance to that idea because Routledge is a for-profit publisher. And the idea that the review and the association were not part of the market in that sense gave many people strong ideas about what we should do. But coincidentally, FemiCon, or Feminist Economics, the journal, was beginning at that time. And Diana Strassman and I worked together as we took both journals to Routledge. And we sort of talked about contracts together and tried to deal with some hesitancy that many people had. But without telling too much of that long story, the consequence for the association was not just that we found a strong support system for publishing the journal, so the mechanics of getting the journal out all the time and so forth, but it also transformed the association from it being a pay-as-you-go type association to one that made money. And like many of the other heterodox associations that subsequently moved to commercial publishers, I characterize them as legacy associations and journals in the sense that they had long histories that later people elsewhere with the globalization of publishing were interested in. And so I think if you review the treasurer's accounts for the ASE, you'll see that there's quite a bit of money there, and for many other associations too, whereas prior to that, the monies that were in surplus for the conference fees when associations had their conferences were the only means of paying the costs of publishing the journals. So it's a side of my history that doesn't perhaps immediately come forward. Um, the experience I had editing the journal over so many years showed me many different types of scholars. I think the feminists actually came in a little bit later, in the later 1980s. Julie Nelson published one of her first papers where she shows two pillars of concepts uh, uh, representing male and female perspectives, showing the exclusion of the latter from standard economics. And so we constantly had people come into the ASE who found it as a welcoming place. Uh, I think I might be anticipating a question that you're about to ask, but I'll simply say at this point, the attraction, I think, for many people who came into the ASE was a clear commitment to social justice. Mm-hmm. And then the idea that economics is value laden, in contrast to mainstream thinking that it is a value neutral type of subject, social science.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So for those of us who are relatively newer to the ASE, could you provide us with a brief history of the organization, really how it got started, some things we already talked about, but the major changes within the organization as well?
Well, I've touched on some of this already. The paper that I've given you, the social economics paper, it appears in a Elgar volume on alternative approaches to political economy. And I saw the task there to not only get the pre-20th century history in Europe of social economic thinking, cooperativism, and in the Catholic tradition, Catholic social thinking, solidarist, something that is no longer very present in the current ASE, but was a big part of the early history. I think a lot of people don't really quite know how extensive the cooperativist socialist movement was in the US in the 20th century. And so this was a strong current. And then, of course, we had the Depression and the war, World War II. And it was after the war that these threads were brought back again. So the part of the history that I've already suggested was the founding of the association, or the Catholic Economic Association, in 1942 at Marquette, as a matter of fact. And then the beginning of the journal in 44. The founders, it may surprise some people, were Jesuits. The award, the Lifetime Achievement Award that the ASE has, the Thomas Devine Award, he was a Jesuit. And his values, though he was a fairly standardly trained economist, his values were quite progressive. So he came out early for reparations, racial reparations, when nobody was talking about such a thing. This is when Jim Crow is still quite strong in the United States, and the whole history of slavery is somewhat suppressed, if not forgotten. So the ASE really sort of changed into a distinctly heterodox association because of that pluralistic character that was encouraged by the early founders. They saw a wider tent, to use a common expression, that would support social justice concerns and would support the idea that economics is an inherently value-laden subject. Attention this created, as I suggested with Devine, is that most of these early people in the CEA were trained in standard micro type rational maximization, rationality, comparative statics, all that stuff that we learned in micro. They were trained in that. And so when the association went explicitly heterodox and new ideas were brought in, it was really quite a challenge, because people didn't always find ways to talk to one another. But the key, I think, for a long time has been, and I hope it continues to be, that people respect each other and are welcoming. It's a open, friendly association. And I think that's, again, a reason that people continue to come into it. Um, so of the groups that were in there originally, the institutionalists, especially the Veblennian people, were especially strong. And many times we had very close cooperation with the AFE people. And then quite a few influential social economic Marxists were engaged in the ASE for many years. And then Keynesianism moved into post-Keynesianism, and then a bit later, feminists became quite active in the ASE. So I hope I'm following the thread.
Yes, absolutely. So we're gonna turn our attention to a few social economics questions now. So how does social economics challenge the foundational assumptions of neoclassical economics, and what implications does this have for our understanding of economic phenomena?
Well, I tried to give a lead into that question,
Hmm.
actually, because the tension in the organization, overcome by the commitment to pluralism, was between a fairly standard training, because that's all there was really, is standard training in the 60s and 70s.
Hmm.
Uh, the ability of schools like the one that you went to and others that teach non-standard programs, uh, that that education, that training, those courses developed somewhat slowly. We had research that was heterodox and non-standard, but well, it's strange when people's deepest intuitions are uh, the neoclassical ones that we all know. So foremost in that, in my view, is the idea of the atomistic individual, the idea that the person is an isolated, rational, maximizing being. And so my first book, where I start to talk about identity, the theory of the individual in economics, I say that, well, what we're talking about is a socially embedded individual that is by no means isolated and atomistic. And we need to change the whole conception of how people act in markets in order to accommodate that thinking. So in the social economics paper that I referred to, this the Elgar volume, uh, I say in the abstract that what social economists hold is that the economy is embedded in society, not, as I think a neoclassical economist would argue, society is embedded in the economy, or specifically in markets, because it's all markets exchange. It's not the classical political economy, uh, class-based, production-based, and so forth understanding. So that Homo economicus foundation, I think, underlies how we talk about the equilibrium process, the market process, the centrality of markets. Uh, and as you know, that is an entirely a so-called value-free descriptive scientific characterization that we're taught as one of the main method principles in microeconomic neoclassical analysis. And so much falls away when you start to uh, give up those basic assumptions. And the coincident evolution of the economics field in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where heterodoxy became a recognized domain of economic thinking, I think facilitated that critique of uh, the neoclassical foundations and made it possible for people in social economics to come forward with ideas that they felt strongly but couldn't find a way to locate in the standard way in which we teach and much of what gets published. You know, the journal birth or emergence story is important here too. So to go back to my remarks about the commercial publishers, I've always trusted Routledge in terms of their instincts and their commitment to progressive thinking, uh, but that these publishers were successful in promoting continual emergence of new journals with uh, uh, new opportunities for heterodoxy, and Elgar was very much involved in doing this also. I remember in the early years, people were surprised that they could publish books and articles and so forth. And that credentialing is just a survival issue for people. So the long story for the ASE and for the review is it moved into the ranks of a recognized, established, some now 50 years when I was in it, heterodox, pluralistic journal. And now I think it's a natural home for many people who come to the ASE. Uh, they're not quite sure what social economics is, um, but nonetheless they like the emphasis on social justice and so forth.
Mhm.
I'll make a contrast with AFI and even IAFI in this regard. Both of uh, those groups have, I think, a set of core ideas that are important to how people organize what they think those associations are all about. But I don't think ASE has really core ideas. It's very pluralistic, theoretically, conceptually, as well as um, in terms of the applied research that people do. People do all different sorts of things. And so we were talking before we began about stratification economics. And excuse me, uh, people find that they can talk about stratification in the ASE, though there's no clear markers that in the previous publications of the journals and in conferences that this is something that people are doing. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, absolutely. Thank you. So beyond critique, how does social economics propose alternative frameworks for conceptualizing economic relations, particularly in terms of power dynamics and institutional structures?
So again, going to the step away from neoclassicism,
Mhm.
if you believe that economics is value laden, then one of the first things you want to do is ask about its policy anchors. And neoclassicism, as you know, is a welfare in a small w efficiency policy program. And essentially, it's aimed at making the market work better. And the way it works is with exchange between people who have really no social identities. They're simply rational maximizers. So once you step away from that, what you want to ask is, uh, well, what would a better life be? Or as the conception of well-being that emerged with many people in the ASE emphasize, what is social provisioning? So social provisioning, of course, extends beyond the market. Uh, how we take care of all sorts of people who are less fortunate, what happens in the household, uh, what in general we do, where our social values influence how we try to make society function better. It sees the market as a part of that story, but not as the way in which we conceptualize it. So I think that the one of the big achievements in social economics was the movement to this uh, broad ideal of well-being that clearly distanced the traditional welfare efficiency ideas uh, and gave many people space under different interpretations of what that social provisioning, social well-being would involve, ways to talk about what things were important to them.
Mhm. Absolutely. And considering the pluralistic nature of economics or socioeconomics that we have already talked about, how can scholars foster a collaborative and inclusive environment for the continual enrichment and evolution of economic theories?
Well, I think I should ask you that question. that's, a, that's a hard one. Uh, it's one of the things about academic life that I've experienced is that there's not a very clear pathway to what happens. There's a lot of unexpected ways in which people's research changes. I think people will see they worked on something and suddenly they say, no, I'm working on this now. And so it's hard to give guidance to people about how they ought to pursue uh, this uh, strange domain,
Mhm.
social science, economics, which has done its very best to isolate itself from other social sciences where so many other important ideas exist. I think another difficulty uh, for us today is that there is, I believe, a lot of change in economics itself. So the overwhelming dominance of neoclassical thinking now has given way to something people call mainstream economics. And I've argued it's mainstream pluralism. And I've tried to characterize economics as having a core and a periphery, and the periphery has borderland relationships with other social sciences, psychology, sociology. And so it's, uh, I think we have to, as most academics are, I think, be optimistic that the the way our scholarly work proceeds has some rationality to it in the small r sense, and that people are, even when they have disagreements, able to figure out how to work on topics that are meaningful and important. I don't know
Mhm.
if this answers the question, but
No.
I think I had to be a little bit evasive.
I get it. To me, it's also a lot of it is organic, in my opinion. It's just like this
Sure.
organic change that you have, and then you meet people and you discuss and you get different ideas and from them and different perspectives as well from co-authors and things like that that may change your own.
Yes,
So,
I think that's an excellent word, and it does have some hopefulness wrapped into it. That when you talk to people, things uh, come from those conversations. That's I was at the ASSA meetings in
mhm,
San Antonio, and the attendance is way down. It's basically somewhere less than half of where it was before the pandemic. And as a result, I think many universities and colleges are not funding travel quite so generously. And these conversations that you're referring to, they're very important. And
mhm,
you can't quite do it from Zoom calls because you're doing business on a Zoom call and you need to do whatever you've decided to do. Whereas there's so much sort of accidental conversation in meetings outside of and seeing people that you hadn't seen. And so um, the way in which our field develops is um, it's very hard to explain. I think the change in the field, the change in its relationships with other fields, the interdisciplinarity increasingly emphasized. Um, and not to mention, I think in the world we face some very dire challenges that will require people to
mhm.
attend to what has to be thought through that's not being thought through. So forward looking, not backward looking.
Mhm. Absolutely. So we're going to turn our attention to your research, and I know you have a vast amount of research. So, could you discuss your particular areas of interest within research and really what motivates you to be involved in these areas?
Yes, I'll just precede that by referring back to uh, my beginnings at Marquette.
Mhm,
I gave you also a link to a course called Teaching Economics and Ethics. And this is kind of related to what I've generally done in terms of ethics and economics. But there I tell how over the years of teaching economics and ethics at Marquette, I struggled to find a way to be successful communicating. Uh, the one mistake I made early was presuming too much economics knowledge. I had to figure out how to talk to many students who actually weren't that interested in economics, but thought they should do something about it. So anyway, I just looked back to that because I was going to mention that earlier and skipped it.
mhm,
Well, the main thing that I've done for a number of years now is work on identity theory. So if the person is not an atomistic, socially isolated being, but has close social connections, their very identity comes from that social embeddedness. Well, that is a wonderful idea, but it's complicated to work out. So what I did in quite a bit of my earlier work was investigates social identity theory. And there's two, and according to social psychologists, two ways in which we understand that. There is social group identity, like if you are all from some same ethnic group or gender or any other number of large social groups. And then relational social identity, where you're talking about people that you interact with regularly, like students and teachers, parents and children, employers and employees. And these two types of identity interact. And so I've written about how if we want to explain discrimination as stigmatization, where what happens is that people are characterized in a stereotypical way as social groups are disparaged, then you want to look at how that social identity they have, social group identity, I should say, interacts with their various relational social identities. So when I talk about stigmatization in my uh, uh, paper that you've got the link for, the general theory, that's the Social Science Research Network version, because the published versions, of course, are behind publisher walls. I talk about how discrimination can be facilitated when employers exercise power over employees. That's the relational social identity, by stigmatizing them in terms of some of their social group identities. So as many feminists have argued, and others as well, we have many social group identities. That's termed intersectionality, of course. And you can be manipulated, or your intersectionality can be exploited by those who have power over you by encouraging you to not embrace those social identities which are most threatening to those people in power.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of a long way of talking about how I tried to move from the social identity concept in a concrete, progressive way where I could also make power and ideology important constituents of standard economic explanations. Power and ideology, of course, excluded from most mainstream and all neoclassical economics. So the identity concept is one that can be used in a practical way. When I first started talking about it, I use it in a very philosophical way. I said there's two criteria that any conception of an individual's identity has to meet. So I took Homo economicus.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, you have to show it's a separate being and not it is a genuine individual. And secondly, if that's a persistent identity, that the person can be re-identified in that way over time. So I did use that philosophical criterial approach to take down Homo economicus, to leave space for a socially embedded conception of the person. And so that's where I've done most of my subsequent work. The book that's just come out, I advance a non-rational maximizer account of a socially embedded individual who adjusts over time, reflecting not only future uncertainty, post-Keynesian concern, but past uncertainty, which we don't know very much about either. Well, long set of points there. So as I suggested, I've worked increasingly on stratification economics. One of the advantages of that framework is that rather than, as we were taught in standard courses, that the economy is an equilibrium process with individuals in interaction, the stratification approach says the economy is dominated by a social ordering, a hierarchical ordering of social groups from most privileged to least, and that the whole way in which production, exchange, consumption, and so forth proceeds operates in that fashion. So I have a paper that will come out on that that is not quite finalized, does the history, origins, conceptual foundations of stratification economics. And I just refer to this briefly to contrast what you can get when you emphasize identity. Here again, social group identity, especially important, uh, to this very individualist approach that most economists think is the correct way to proceed. And
Mhm.
most of my professional work has really been in history of economics. That's where at least I've had the most conference behavior, if you like. And so I still am doing history of economics. And the last paper that I put down on that little list is that type of thing. I look at the Chicago School, and when they wrote about proudly about economics imperialism, uh, a bit of bravado about rigor and so forth. And then I look at what a lot of uh, Marxists and post Keynesians have, especially in connection with financialization of economics, have associated with economic imperialism, the post-war way in which the global North extended in a neo-colonial fashion its power into the global South. And so the paper, written with two colleagues from University of Turin, Mario Cedrini and Angela Ambrosino, uh, looks at Chicago School economics imperialism and what we saw in post-war economic imperialism. It says two sides of the same coin. That paper was published in Rope, and I like how it brings political economy and history of economics together. So what am I going to work on in the future? I think you mentioned the word dignity before. I've used this as a key concept to talk about the normative stance in social economics. That if you look back to the earliest people in the two associations, this was always a shared point of thinking that if we're to think about social justice uh, and we take individuals seriously, it has to be that respect for individuals and their dignity is a central idea. So I do have a paper in that little list there, economics as a normative discipline, where that argument is made. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Never have someone to talk about their own research, or you never get rid of them.
No, that's fascinating. And you also, so congratulations on winning the Warren Samuels Award on your work titled Redirecting Economic Policy After the Pandemic, Expanding Black Reparations. So from your work, what do you think are the recurring lessons for the US from both the recent pandemic as well as the Great Recession regarding the impact on inequality and disadvantaged social groups?
Well, the paper that I gave, the one that you've just named, I begin by asking what are the enduring lessons from the pandemic and the Great Recession, and I
Mhm.
refer to your paper with your co-author Jacobs,
Mhm.
and you show that disadvantaged groups did worse in the pandemic, and other research has shown that disadvantaged groups did worse after the Great Recession. And then we have a tremendous amount of research now, Raj Chetty and many others, showing that lower income groups are doing worse intergenerationally. Uh, that is, over the longer run, the so-called dream of advancing uh, where beyond where your parents were is no longer uh, really available to most people. And so that, I think, is one of the fundamental lessons of this time, that to give a richer economic explanation, the way in which the economy is changing is strengthening power oligarchic firms and worsening the wages and incomes of working people, and the future is not promising. So the step that I uh, say needs to be taken here is, again, a stratification approach. We need to see the economy as structurally working in that manner that some social groups are better off and other groups are not. And that's of course, a value-laden view, because we think that those who are continually put at a disadvantage are unfairly put
Mhm.
there, and we should remedy that sort of situation.
Mhm. And in what ways do from your work, mainstream economic policies fall short in addressing challenges related to increasing inequality? And how could progressive economic policies differ from such mainstream approaches?
The opening part of the paper characterizes mainstream economic policy as ameliorative, hard word to say, uh, ameliorating uh, uh, externalities, uh, things that don't work smoothly in the market process, with the goal of making markets work better. But my premise is that markets are not making many people better, they're making many people worse off. And so the market system has to be changed, it has to be transformed in ways that take social justice into account. And that's how I enter into the topic of reparations.
Mhm.
So the paper is about specifically about racial reparations, but for people who like to work on ethics and economics, there's a tremendous literature on different kinds of reparations: indigenous peoples, climate, women, and they all share the idea that we can't assume, as conventional economics has assumed, that the markets will take care of social problems.
Mhm.
I just comment that the Samuels Prize was very meaningful to me because Warren Samuels was one of my professors at Michigan State, and
Uh,
he was a dedicated and committed pluralist and one of the important people in the ASE for many years.
yeah, that's fascinating. So how does, and from your work, how does the historical racial segregation structure in the US impact the effectiveness of reparations in addressing the racial wealth gap?
Well, that question is at the heart of the paper
Mm.
because what the main view of reparations is right now, as developed by Sandy Darity and others, is that we have um, restitution for descendants of the enslaved. Uh, People today who can trace back their origins to people who were enslaved are entitled to a compensation for those earlier wrongs and crimes. And this framework has been developed quite well. It's been thought through. There's a important figure in the Black economist earlier named Brown, who uh, developed much of this early thinking. And Sandy Darity and others have considered multiple ways in which you can calculate and explain reparations. And what they have settled upon is the amount that should be paid, its magnitude would be determined by what would be needed to eliminate the racial wealth gap. So you can determine what the racial wealth gap is, and therefore you can then determine who the eligible recipients would be. Uh, Obama's not included because he's not a descendant of uh, an enslaved person in the United States, but his family is, his daughters and his wife, Michelle. Uh, and so once you've determined that amount of money, then it's a question of delivery and the legal process and commitment to doing so. What, however, I have argued is that if one of the aims here is not just restitution, but eliminating the racial wealth gap, then it's quite likely that the racial wealth gap will re-widen subsequent to any payment of reparations. And I can't go through that argument in very great detail
Mm.
here, so I hope people will look at the paper. It's posted on the ASSA site. Um, but essentially, what I argue is that the long history of racial segregation, which has produced communities and institutions uh, that are undermined in their capacities, economic and social, uh, has made the ability of the payment of individual reparations to break down that social structure so deeply rooted in American society uh, questionable.
Mm.
That we will continue, despite payments of reparations, to have uh, high levels of social segregation. The racist values in American society are just very difficult to overcome, as in other societies. So what I try to argue is that reparations have to be extended beyond individual payments to include monies that would be used to break down social segregation. And I characterize these as social capital investments, one form of human capital, one form of public capital. And so in a simple way of putting it, when the fundamental problem is social structural, racial segregation, simply paying the descendants of those who suffered for those past injustices is not going to directly address the continuing problem of a social racial segregation.
Mhm. Yeah, so I was wanted to see if you could expand on that notion of the human capital investments that you mentioned in your paper.
Yeah, so this is a distinctly social economics concept.
Mhm.
I've worked on social capital a little bit, and it's basically associated with social networks and social norms or trust relationships. And so if you talk about a community health clinic,
Mhm.
it becomes a place where people in a community go, and they hear from others. They can go there. They trust the providers. Uh, the the unwillingness, the reluctance sometimes that people have to go to health facilities because they're not sure who runs them and what their uh, motives are and so
Mhm.
forth, can be overcome by that kind of social trust uh, 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 outcome that
Mhm.
can be promoted and facilitated when there is material support for those types of institutions. And so if you do any research on community health clinics, you find that they're drastically underfunded, and they rarely can maintain the provider ranks that they need. Their
Mhm.
outreach is impaired. And so a social capital investment that builds on those social relationships, uh, I think is one way to begin to target uh, the consequences of significant urban and rural social and racial segregation.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I find it fascinating you mentioned that, especially with the community health centers. I actually sit on the board of a community health center in Idaho and just see the needs that they are able to address within the community that otherwise individuals would not get access to. So absolutely. It's very
That's very
interesting.
interesting. So
Yeah.
you said you were before you were going to do some work on health economics. I think
Mhm.
that underserved
Mhm.
community, lower income people often can't afford Obamacare
Mhm.
and other costs that we take for granted. I think that's a great research topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I have two standard sign-up questions that I always ask, and we will also link everything in our show notes as well. So, can you tell our listeners where they can find you in terms of your research, follow you, read more about you, and so forth?
Well, I gave you the links for
Mm-hmm.
those. So I
Mm-hmm.
gave you my webpage, ResearchGate,
Got it.
SSRN, and so forth. So those I think are the easiest ways to go. You can find people can find what they might be interested in.
Perfect.
Um,
We'll do that.
yeah, I
And
think
then,
that's
oh, go ahead.
no. Go ahead.
Okay. And then I also want to end our discussion with looking forward. So what do you envision the future of social economics looks like? I know it's a hard question, but
Well, I've been trying to think about that question the last number of minutes here.
Mhm.
Well, on the one hand, I'm optimistic. On the other hand, I'm pessimistic. The
Mhm.
pessimism comes from the continual turnover in people in the ASE, and that there's no obvious center. So
Mhm.
attracts people to social economics, I think, is the emphasis on social justice,
Mhm.
the idea that it's a progressive, heterodox association, that it's pluralistic, and that it's open to many different types of approaches. So that's what I think attracts people, but it's also potential weakness because there's no clear organizing center as in, I think, IAFE or in AFE or for the post-Keynesians, where you have pretty clear meeting point conceptually and theoretically, or at least a number of clear meeting points. And so that's the challenge, I think. However, on the optimistic side, this is the way the ASE has always been, and that from the vantage point of someone who's seen it for many years, it has moved from one group of people to another successfully, and it's as I characterized it, a legacy institution, one that is beneficiary of the globalization of economic thinking, especially North American and European, means that it will have resources to go forward. I know other associations are also have worries about their survivability and their long run prospects, and many of them are also sitting on large amounts of money. So there are concrete strategies available for promoting travel, promoting young people, promoting ability for new scholars to find mentors and places to work. So all of that, I think, goes on the positive side of the ledger. And then maybe a last point is that I think many people will agree the future for everyone on this planet is a little bit scary. War seems to be a perennial problem. Climate change is just a terrible future. You know, as the world economy has developed, most cities are coastal, and they're not going to be able to sustain those locations. And then when you have tremendous migration of population, not only do many people die, but then you have all these political conflicts that arise. So I've talked to people sort of informally about how they see world population in the future, and they say, well, if the worst predictions of climate change come about, we could lose easily 10% of world population, which is over 100 million, which is not a easy thing for a society, human society, to weather. It's frightening, really.
Yeah.
So this is not supposed to be a dismal conclusion here. It was to suggest that I think people will be drawn to social economics and other heterodox approaches because at least they're trying to come up with new ideas and not just promise the market will come to the rescue.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time and being here with us today.
And thank you for your interview and your wonderful questions and all your help in this.